So after 2 weeks of mission emphasis and what wonderfully inspiring speakers we've had the last couple of weeks, we are getting back to our sermon series on the life of Joseph. So I'm going to ask you to turn to Genesis chapter 41, and we are going to pick that up at verse 38 today. Now, what we've been talking about as we look at Joseph's life is kind of the funny and difficult to understand sometimes ways of God's providence, okay? And from the very beginning of this sermon series, we've talked about how, ordinarily we think about God's providence or we experience God's providence with regard to the blessings that we receive, with regard to all the things that go right in our lives. And, that's wonderful. That is a wonderful example, wonderful examples of God's providence in our lives. But see, there's another side to the coin as well. There's a flip side to God's providence, and this is due to his sovereignty and his all-powerfulness and his all-knowingness and his all-lovingness, that even the difficult circumstances that we experience in this life, God, although he doesn't directly compel people to behave the way that they do, the destructive ways, he is able to work through that to his own accomplishment of goals and purposes. And we see that very, very clearly in Joseph's life. Joseph starts out in a very favored position. He is the favored son in his family, even though he is not the oldest. He is the oldest of Jacob's one wife, Rachel, the wife that he loved most of all. And so Joseph is raised in this atmosphere where he is just the apple of his father's eye. Understandably, this makes his other 10 or 11 brothers very jealous, and they start to resent him, and they start to look for opportunities to derail that somehow. And it even comes to the point where they decide that they're going to kill their brother Joseph. Now, God does not allow that to happen. Instead, Joseph is sold into slavery and taken down to Egypt. And so Joseph goes from favored son in his family, the heir apparent as the patriarch of God's chosen family, the descendants of Abraham. And he goes from that favored status to a lowly slave. That's the first devastating blow in his life. But God is present with him, and God shows him favor, even in the household of Potiphar, who is the slave owner that he was working for. And he becomes the head of that entire household until Potiphar's wife gets an eye for Joseph, being a handsome man, tries to seduce him. And over again, Joseph chooses obedience to God rather than succumbing to the temptation that Potiphar's wife is putting out there every single day. Well, good for Joseph, but a woman scorned, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. And so she brings false accusations against him. And he is thrown into prison anyway. So he goes from favored son in his family to slave in a master's house to a prisoner in a dungeon. But even there, God is present. God is with him. God is preparing him for something. And God gives him the ability, God in his providence, gives Joseph the ability to interpret dreams and brings into his path these two royal officials, a cupbearer and a baker. And Joseph interprets their dreams, and what Joseph interprets comes to pass. But the cupbearer, who is the one who actually makes it through that whole scenario, forgets about Joseph until Pharaoh himself has a couple of very troubling dreams. And then the cupbearer says, hey, I don't know if he's still there. I haven't been tracking on it. I forgot about it, but there's this guy that I met in prison that has the ability to interpret dreams. And so Joseph is brought before Pharaoh. So from favored son to lowly slave to prisoner, condemned criminal, even though he was innocent of all charges, and now he finds himself in the court of the most powerful man in the Near Eastern world. And he interprets Pharaoh's dreams, and we pick that up as soon as those dreams have been interpreted in verse 38. I'm getting there. So Pharaoh asked his officials, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" Now, not only had Joseph interpreted the dreams, he also suggested a course of action to Pharaoh and said, hey, you need to find a guy that's going to lead you through what is in the near future for the nation of Egypt. And so here is Pharaoh asking his advisors, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and men shouted before him, make way! Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift hand or foot in all Egypt. Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphanath-Paneah and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, to be his wife. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, it is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. The second son he named Ephraim and said, it is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, go to Joseph and do what he tells you. When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the countries came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe in all the world. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. All right, so as I mentioned a few weeks ago, we looked at the first half of Genesis 41, Joseph being called out of prison to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. And as we have heard today, obviously this was a significant turning point in Joseph's life. Now, Joseph indeed might have felt or sensed that this was a major turning point in his life. And I would guess that perhaps he hoped that by offering his services to Pharaoh in this way, that he would subsequently be released from prison. At the very least, maybe if he proved himself to Pharaoh in this way, he could get out of that dungeon where he had been serving for years. I would guess that maybe in his wildest dreams, Joseph might have thought, not only might Pharaoh release me from prison, but perhaps he would also give me my freedom back as well. Well, I don't think Joseph could have possibly anticipated exactly what God was up to in all this. He could never have imagined just how dramatic this turn was going to be. Joseph had been called before Pharaoh to interpret his dreams, these troubling dreams that the magicians and wise men and all of Egypt were unable to interpret. And in the aftermath of interpreting those dreams, something absolutely unbelievable occurs. He is put in charge of the entire nation of Egypt. This is the amazing response, the unexpected response of God's providence. And so I want to walk through the text this morning because it has some important things to teach us about how we are to respond to God's providence. In the blessedness and the bright side of the coin of God's providence, and also on the darker side and the difficult circumstances brought about by God's providence. Throughout the story so far, we have seen that Joseph is faithful, that he is a man of integrity, and that regardless of the circumstances, he seems bound and determined to respond to God in whatever circumstances with obedience. His orientation is toward God. And so, because of that, he is the same man as the favored one of his family, as he is in the household of a slave owner, as he is in the bowels of the dungeon of a prison, as he is in the courts of the Pharaoh. He is the same man because his orientation is consistent. His orientation is toward God, obedience to God, what pleases God. And because of this, in God's grace, he provides Joseph with precisely what he needs to navigate each situation. And in this situation that we just read about, Joseph has the ability from God to interpret Pharaoh's troubling dreams. And here is the interpretation. In the near future of Egypt, there would be 7 years of famine that followed 7 years of great abundance, of great plenty. Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dream, said, look, the next 7 years are going to be great, but the 7 years subsequent to that are going to be devastating. He gave Pharaoh the interpretation, but as I mentioned, he also made suggestions to Pharaoh. I mean, where does this guy get off? He actually gives instructions to Pharaoh, unsolicited, and he advises Pharaoh in how Pharaoh should respond to God's providence on this national scale, in this coming time of plenty, in preparation for this time of famine. And so Pharaoh, rather than getting angry with Joseph, rather than banishing Joseph from his presence for being so arrogant and taking such liberties, he turns to his advisors and he asks them, can we find someone that will be able to navigate our nation through the coming 14 years? Will we be able to find someone like this in all of Egypt? And it seems to me as though that was a rhetorical question because he immediately turns to Joseph without even waiting for an answer from his advisors. And he appoints Joseph to be the Grand Vizier of Egypt, second in command only to Pharaoh himself. And I want you to understand how truly unheard of this would be. Absolutely unheard of, truly amazing. I mean, after all, I've mentioned it a couple times already. Joseph was a foreigner. He was not an Egyptian. He wasn't just not an Egyptian, he was also a slave. He was also a convicted criminal, a prisoner. Truly amazing. Truly amazing that he goes from those rags to the riches that Pharaoh offers him. And consider the step of faith that this was for Pharaoh as well. This step of faith, because the Spirit of the one true God manifests himself so clearly in and through his servant Joseph. In truth, we could say that God grants Pharaoh, an unbeliever, the wisdom to appoint the perfect man for the job ahead. And I want you to notice, too, that Pharaoh got Joseph's message. Remember how before Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, he said, let's get one thing straight. Let's get one thing straight, Pharaoh. I have no idea how to interpret dreams, but God does. And God, for some reason, reveals those dreams to me. And so I offer you only the wisdom that God has first granted me. And the way that Pharaoh addresses Joseph after this proves that he, at least in some measure, accepted Joseph's testimony at face value. It says, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. So even though Pharaoh speaks out of a polytheistic worldview, indeed, his people and perhaps himself to a certain extent considered him a god, Pharaoh a god. But even though he speaks out of a much different religious worldview, when confronted by the one true God's sovereignty and providence, he speaks an essential truth about Joseph, that he was a man indwelt by the Spirit of God. Verse 40, you shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. Pharaoh placed a signet ring on Joseph's finger. He dressed Joseph in fine robes. Joseph is used to that from the very first story that we read. Placed a gold chain around Joseph's neck. Gave Joseph a brand new sleek company car, chariot. Gave Joseph a new name and a wife. Talk about a reversal of fortune. I mean, the suddenness and the drama of Joseph's exaltation here, it doesn't make his head swell. It doesn't make him arrogant. Remember, I said he's the same guy that he was in prison, that he was in Potiphar's household, than he was in his own household. It just reinforces in his heart that this could only have happened through the providence of God, and that there is a reason for this. And that becomes very clear in the way that Joseph responds to this reversal of fortune. Joseph understands that only God could have orchestrated a turn of events like this. It reinforces in his heart a knowledge that he has exhibited throughout his life, as it is recorded in Scripture so far, that God works in his own way, that God works according to his own time, and that God works for his own glory. And as his people, as Joseph is an example to us, we are called to be faithful and patient, and to persevere in all circumstances in our trust of the one true, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God. As I said, this is precisely what Joseph does throughout his life. He was faithful. And regardless of the circumstances, he took advantage of the opportunities that God placed before him. He was patient, frustrated, I'm sure, but patient when things seemed to go against him. He waited for God to reveal his plan, and he continued to trust in God throughout every single day. God will provide what I need for this moment. And God, true to God, worked in his own way, in his own time, and for his own glory. But at the same time, I don't want you to think that all of a sudden everything is wine and roses for Joseph. Yes, this is one of the biggest reversals of fortune in history, okay? This is a Cinderella story. Rags to riches, as I've already said, but I want you to notice that it's not perfect. It's not perfect. Chapter 41 makes mention also of Joseph's kind of perpetual, ongoing personal pain. Makes mention of his personal pain and this void in his heart and in his life, even in the midst of this dramatic public success. Genesis provides a brief description of Joseph's administration through that time of plenty, that 7 years of plenty. And then it makes reference to some of God's blessings in Joseph's private life, namely his marriage and the birth of his 2 sons. And did you notice that we were told in our text that Joseph is now 30 years old? I found it interesting as I was reading John Calvin's commentaries that he offers 2 possible reasons why that little detail is inserted into the story. I don't know that it moves the story just by itself on face value, but John Calvin has 2 possible reasons. First, he says it is to reinforce just how dramatic it was that that God would place Joseph in this high position. I mean, think about it, a 30-year-old man placed over an entire nation, from prison to being the head of a country. As I mentioned before, God, in his providence, had orchestrated the unthinkable. But second, I think that detail is inserted into our text to remind us just how long Joseph had been an exile, a slave, and a prisoner. Remember, we also were told a few chapters previous that Joseph was 17 years old when his brothers sold him into slavery. Now he's 30. That is a long time to be away from home. That is a long time to be away from that father who loved him so deeply, that father who looked at him as the apple of his eye. And you know, when all is said and done, this is a little foreshadowing by me here, over 20 years are going to pass before Jacob's family would enjoy any kind of family reunion. So patience is a lesson that God is teaching to Joseph and to Jacob and to their entire family and to us, his people. Also, look at the names that Joseph gives to his children. I mean, those, if nothing else, those prove the complexity involved in Joseph's feelings and Joseph's state of mind. Verses 51 and 52. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potipharah, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." The second son he named Ephraim and said, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." So first and foremost, these names testify to Joseph's confidence in the goodness of God. Let's just start on the positive, okay? This is quite evident in the names of his sons. As we contemplate Joseph's story, I don't ever want you to underestimate Joseph's persevering faith in God. Joseph sensed how God continued to bless him in and through both adversity and success to an extent that many of us haven't reached yet. We haven't reached that spiritual maturity yet, that anything in life that God throws at us is for a redemptive reason. It takes a lot of practice, and it takes a lot of testing. But that's first and foremost. They testify to Joseph's confidence in the glory and the goodness of God. But look at the names of those sons again. God has made me forget all my trouble. God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Joseph recognizes that God has blessed him beyond belief, beyond imagination, being given this measure, finally, of authority and responsibility and respect and honor. But these names also speak of Joseph's pain and his sadness and his brokenness. And they serve as a small window or two small windows into Joseph's soul. Even in the midst of this unprecedented success, there was still something significant missing. So let's pause, consider for a moment what the Bible tells us here about Joseph's interior life. Yes, he was a man of gratitude. He was thankful that God had helped him to forget his trouble and his father's household. Clearly, he thought that with regard to his family, with regard to that aspect of his life, this was a wound that he was just going to carry around with him for the rest of his days. This was just the reality. I mean, best case scenario in his mind was that he would have the ability to cope with that pain through forgetfulness. And Joseph, he expresses gratitude to God for giving him that ability to cope, even though the pain and the sadness and the brokenness were still present, just buried deep, just not thought about. And it becomes quite obvious when we notice the two words he uses to characterize his life: trouble and affliction. Trouble and affliction. So even in the midst of great success, the greatest success of his life is characterized by trouble and affliction. And here too, we need to remember that Joseph at this point does not know what God ultimately has in store for him. He cannot, just like we can't, trace the path of God's providence for him as it moves into the future. So, along with this deep faith and deep trust, we also perceive in him a sense of resignation. That Joseph will never again have the joy of fellowship with his father and with his brothers and with his family. The best he can hope for is to forget it. But you know what? God is going to show Joseph that his plan is better by far than even Joseph's best hopes. And that, my friends, is the nature of God's love and his grace. He delights in bringing blessing where there is only trouble and affliction. And with that glimpse into the future, our passage moves from Joseph's administration in the time of plenty to Joseph's administration through the years of famine. And here, again, we see Joseph's wisdom in application. And this is how God actually sets the stage, though Joseph doesn't realize it, for a re-encounter with his family. God is willing to do amazing, unbelievable things to advance the good of his people. Receive what God's word teaches us here. Take it in. God is willing to do unbelievable things to advance the good of his people. I mean, look, God plunged Egypt and the entire Near Eastern world into a cycle of 14 years of plenty and famine in order to bless the family of Jacob. Just as Joseph was the apple of Jacob's eye, so God's people are the apple of his eye. In fact, the history of all nations is merely a backdrop to God's redemptive plan, God's gospel providence, the way he rules the world for the sake of his people. And it begins to dawn on us when we read verse 56 and 57. When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the countries came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe in all the world. And when we read those words, if we've never read this story before, we suspect that God is up to something. Something that will dramatically impact the family of Jacob. In fact, God was shaping world events to effect a beautiful family reunion in the life of his people. And in the next life, perhaps we will finally realize how often God has done similar things for us. God rules the world for the good of his people and for his own glory. Now, there's only one more thing I want to show you as we finish up, and it's in the final verse. When the people begin to come to Pharaoh and ask him for bread, he says to them, "Go to Joseph and do whatever it is he tells you to do." And I want to ask, do those words sound familiar to you? Think about other stories in the Bible. Do those words sound familiar to you? There was a time right before Jesus Christ performed his first miracle, when his mother Mary, having had a conversation with her son, turns to the servants of the household and says, "Whatever he says to you, do it." That's from John 2, verses 1 to 5. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Dear woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My time has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now, I think it's probably far-fetched that Mary knew that she was echoing Pharaoh's words regarding Joseph. But I want you to remember that Mary's son was far greater than even Joseph, the grand vizier of Egypt. See, Jesus Christ was not simply a talented administrator. He could actually speak reality into being. So Joseph was able to live up to that particular compliment from Pharaoh because God had prepared him and he had the luxury of planning for 7 years. Jesus Christ, on the other hand, has the power within himself to effect the fulfillment of his word because he is truly God. And brothers and sisters, that reminds us that in the midst of our own providential struggles, the things we experience as blessing and the things that we experience as troubling adversity, the one to whom we ought to run and the one in whom we ought to take refuge is Jesus Christ, who laid down his very life for the good of his people, for our greatest good. Amen. Let's pray.